The concrete floor was cold beneath his knees. Miguel Sandoval could taste copper in his mouth, blood from where they'd struck him across the face. His hands were bound behind his back with coarse rope that cut into his wrists. Through swollen eyes he saw the boots first, black leather, polished to a mirror shine, stopping just inches from where his head hung low. "Look at me." The voice was soft, almost gentle. That was what terrified him most, not the guns pointing at his skull, not the warehouse walls that had witnessed dozens of executions. It was the calmness in that voice, the certainty of a man who had spoken these words before, who knew exactly what would happen next. Miguel forced his head up. The man standing before him wore an expensive suit, tailored perfectly to his frame. His face showed no anger, no emotion at all. Just the faint suggestion of curiosity, as if Miguel were an insect he was deciding whether to crush. "You stole from me," the man said. "Not a question, a statement." I can explain." "I don't want explanations. I want you to understand something." The man crouched down, bringing his face level with Miguel's. "Fear is more valuable than loyalty. Loyalty can be faked. Fear cannot." This was how Javier Moreno ruled his empire. Not through trust or brotherhood, through calculated terror that spread like frost across every person who entered his orbit. This was the story of how he built that empire and how fear, his greatest weapon, would ultimately become the poison that destroyed everything he touched. Javier Moreno was born in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. The houses were cobbled together from corrugated metal and wood scraps clustered along dirt roads that turned to rivers of mud when the rains came. His father worked in the fields, breaking his back for wages that wouldn't feed the family. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the city, taking 2 buses each way, returning home long after dark, with exhaustion carved into her face. Poverty wasn't just an inconvenience in Javier's world. It was a disease that infected everything, every conversation, every dream, every possibility. He watched his younger sister go to bed hungry more nights than not. He wore the same torn shoes until his feet bled through the soles. He learned early that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who took and those who had everything taken from them. The day his father died, Javier was 14, a heart attack in the fields under the brutal sun. The landowner sent the body home with 2 other workers, along with 3 days' wages. No apology, no compensation, just a corpse and pocket change, as if a man's life could be calculated and dismissed so easily. At the funeral, Javier's mother wept. His sister wept. But Javier felt something else crystallizing inside him, something cold and hard. He stood at the grave and made a promise to himself. He would never be powerless again. He would never kneel. He would never beg. Whatever it took, he would become the one others feared. 2 months later, Javier left home. He lied to his mother, told her he'd found work in the city. Instead, he went looking for the men he had heard whispered about in the village, the ones who moved product through the mountains, who carried guns and drove trucks with tinted windows, the ones who answered to no one. He found them at a cantina on the outskirts of town. 3 men sat at a corner table, their presence creating an invisible barrier that kept other patrons at a distance. Javier approached, with his heart hammering, but his face calm. He'd practiced this moment in his mind 100 times. "I want to work," he said simply. The men looked him over. One laughed. "Go home, kid. This isn't for children." "I'm strong, I'm smart, and I'm not afraid." The oldest of the three, a man named Raúl with scars crossing his forearms, studied Javier with narrowed eyes. Everyone's afraid. The question is what you're willing to do despite it. Anything, Javier said. That single word changed the trajectory of his life. Javier's first job was simple. Drive a truck from one town to another. Don't look in the back. Don't stop for anything. Don't speak to anyone. He was given an address, a set of keys, and a warning that if he failed, they'd find him wherever he tried to hide. He completed the job without incident, though his hands shook on the steering wheel the entire 3-hour drive. When he delivered the truck, Raúl handed him more cash than his father had made in 6 months. Javier stared at the bills, understanding for the first time the scale of the world he'd entered. This money represented something his father never had: choice, power, freedom from the crushing weight of poverty. But it also represented something else, something he couldn't yet name, a price that couldn't be calculated in currency. The jobs came more frequently: deliveries, pickups, messages carried to men who lived behind high walls with guards at the gates. Javier proved himself reliable, quiet, and fearless in a way that impressed the organization. He never asked questions. He never hesitated. He understood instinctively that in this world, curiosity was a liability and doubt was fatal. After 6 months, Raúl brought him into the inner circle. "There's a man," Raúl explained, "who's been talking to the federal police, giving them information about routes, names, operations. He needs to be dealt with." Javier knew what "dealt with" meant. He also knew this was a test, the real entry fee into the organization. They needed to know if he was willing to cross the line from accomplice to participant, from witness to perpetrator. "Where is he?" Javier asked. They drove to a neighborhood Javier recognized. Working-class homes with small yards, laundry hanging on lines, children's toys scattered on porches. The man lived alone, they told him, a former associate who'd turned coward, who thought cooperation would save him. Javier knocked on the door. When the man opened it, his face registered recognition a split second before Javier raised the gun. The shot was deafening in the quiet street. The man crumpled backward, blood spreading beneath him in a dark pool. Javier stood frozen for a moment, the gun heavy in his hand. He'd imagined this moment would feel different, that he'd feel powerful, in control. Instead, he felt nothing. Just a strange emptiness where emotion should have been. He walked back to the car, where Raúl waited with an approving nod. "You're one of us now," Raúl said. That night, alone in the small room he rented, Javier stared at his hands. They looked the same as before. But he knew something fundamental had shifted. He'd stepped across a threshold, and there was no walking back through it. The boy who'd left his village seeking opportunity was gone. In his place was something else, something harder, colder, more capable of what this world required. Over the next 3 years, Javier rose through the organization with calculated precision. He observed everything, how power flowed, who held it, how it was maintained. He noticed that the most successful operators weren't the loudest or the most violent. They were the ones who understood that fear was a tool requiring careful calibration. Too little and you were weak, too much and you created chaos that drew unwanted attention. The organization he worked for was called La Corona, the Crown. It controlled smuggling routes through the northern territories, moving product across borders through a network of tunnels, corrupt officials, and sophisticated logistics. At the top sat Don Arturo, a man in his 60s who'd built the operation over decades. He ruled through a combination of traditional respect and strategic violence. Javier studied Don Arturo the way a student studies a master. He watched how the old man carried himself, the way silence could be more intimidating than shouting, how a measured response carried more weight than explosive anger. He learned that showing mercy could be as effective as brutality if it was done publicly and seemed magnanimous. People would convince themselves they owed you something, that your restraint was a gift rather than strategy. But Javier also saw Don Arturo's weaknesses. The old man clung to outdated methods. He valued loyalty and family connections over competence. He allowed sentiment to cloud judgment, keeping relatives in positions they weren't qualified for, tolerating inefficiency because of personal relationships. In a world that was rapidly evolving, where technology and ruthlessness were reshaping the landscape, Don Arturo's approach seemed increasingly antiquated. Javier began building his own network within the organization. He identified ambitious young operatives like himself, people who understood that the old ways were dying. He did them favors, created debts, positioned himself as someone who got things done. But, unlike Don Arturo, Javier never let emotions interfere with business. Loyalty meant nothing to him. What mattered was fear combined with self-interest, making people more afraid of betraying him than of serving him. His breakthrough came when a rival organization, Los Tigres, attempted to move into La Corona's territory. They'd bribed several border officials and started running their own shipments through what had been exclusive routes. Don Arturo's response was measured: negotiations, attempted diplomacy, trying to carve out territories without open warfare. Javier saw opportunity in the crisis. He went to Don Arturo with a proposal. Let him handle the situation his way. The old man, frustrated by failed negotiations, agreed. What happened next would become legend in the underworld, the story that announced Javier Moreno as something new and terrifying. Javier spent 2 weeks gathering intelligence on Los Tigres. He learned their structure, their leadership, their routines. He identified the 3 highest-ranking members who'd orchestrated the territorial incursion. Then he moved with a speed and brutality that shocked even his own people. On a single night, coordinated teams hit all 3 targets simultaneously. But Javier didn't just kill them. He made them into messages. Their bodies were left in public places, a plaza, a highway overpass, a shopping district, with signs explaining exactly why they died. The message was clear: challenge La Corona and this is your fate. Not a quick death, but something designed to inspire maximum terror. The effect was immediate and profound. Los Tigres withdrew completely, abandoning their expansion plans. Other organizations that had been probing for weaknesses suddenly backed away. Word spread through the criminal network. La Corona had someone new, someone who played by different rules, someone who understood that fear could accomplish what diplomacy couldn't. But the most significant reaction came from within La Corona itself. Javier had acted without seeking permission for the specifics, only for the mandate. He'd exceeded expectations so dramatically that Don Arturo couldn't reprimand him without looking weak. Instead, the old man promoted him, bringing him into the inner leadership circle. Yet privately, Don Arturo was disturbed. He'd seen Javier's handiwork, the calculated cruelty designed purely for psychological impact. This wasn't defense of territory, it was theater of violence, orchestrated to create a reputation. Don Arturo recognized that he'd unleashed something he might not be able to control. He was right to be concerned. Over the following year, Javier consolidated power systematically. He took control of the organization's enforcement arm, positioning his own people in key roles. He modernized operations, implementing compartmentalized structures that limited what any single person knew, making everyone more dependent on central coordination, which he controlled. He built relationships with corrupt officials at higher levels using a combination of bribes and blackmail that was far more comprehensive than Don Arturo's old-school handshake deals. Most importantly, he cultivated his reputation. Every action was designed with psychological impact in mind. When someone stole from the organization, the punishment was swift and public. When someone proved loyal, the rewards were generous and visible. Javier understood that people watched constantly, taking note of patterns, calculating their own survival strategies based on what they observed. He also understood that fear required maintenance. You couldn't simply terrify people once and expect it to last. Fear needed to be refreshed, reinforced, demonstrated regularly. So he created rituals, predictable responses to specific transgressions that everyone knew about. Steal from the organization, brutal, public punishment. Betray to authorities, your family suffered too. Challenge his authority, you disappeared in a way that left everyone wondering what happened, which was often worse than knowing. But he also showed calculated mercy at strategic moments. When a lieutenant made an honest mistake that cost the organization money, Javier forgave him publicly, even covering the loss from his own earnings. The gesture seemed magnanimous, but it served a purpose. It demonstrated that he was fair, that punishment came for disloyalty and incompetence, not honest errors. It made people believe they could survive in his world if they followed the rules. The truth was colder. Javier showed mercy only when it reinforced his power. The lieutenant he'd forgiven became intensely loyal, motivated by gratitude, but also by the understanding that Javier could have killed him and chose not to. That man would now do anything Javier asked, bound by a debt he felt in his bones. Don Arturo's death came on a Tuesday morning. He was found in his estate, slumped over his desk. The official story was a heart attack, stress, age, the burdens of leadership finally catching up. The doctor who signed the death certificate was on the organization's payroll. The autopsy was superficial. Within 48 hours, Don Arturo was buried with honors, and the question of succession hung over La Corona like smoke. There were 3 potential successors: Don Arturo's eldest son, Marco, who'd been groomed for leadership, Sebastián, the underboss who'd served for 20 years, and Javier, the youngest but most capable of the senior leadership. Marco claimed birthright. He argued that La Corona was built by his father and should remain in the family. But Marco was weak. Everyone knew it. He'd lived off his father's reputation his entire life, never proving himself through action. Sebastián claimed experience. He'd been with Don Arturo from the beginning, knew every aspect of the operation. But Sebastián was cautious, risk-averse, exactly the wrong temperament for a changing landscape. Javier said nothing. He simply acted. Within a week of Don Arturo's death, 3 of Marco's strongest supporters disappeared, not killed, disappeared. Their families received no bodies, no confirmation, just absence. The message was clear without being spoken. Align with Marco and this could be you. Sebastián tried to mount a countermove, calling a meeting of senior leadership to discuss succession democratically. Javier attended. When Sebastián proposed that they vote, Javier stood and looked around the table. "Who here believes they're qualified to choose?" he asked. "We don't live in a democracy. We live in a hierarchy of competence and strength. Don Arturo is dead because his methods were outdated. Marco is unfit because he's never proven himself. Sebastián is too cautious to lead in times that demand boldness." He let the silence stretch. Then he delivered the ultimatum that would define his leadership. "I'm taking control of La Corona. Anyone who has a problem with that can speak now." No one spoke. The men at that table understood that this moment had been orchestrated long before Don Arturo died. They understood that Javier had spent years positioning himself for exactly this. They also understood that challenging him meant death, while accepting him meant stability and profit. Sebastian tried one last move. He reached for his weapon. Before his hand closed around it, 3 guns were pointed at him, held by men he'd thought were loyal to him. Javier had turned them weeks ago, quietly, ensuring that any resistance would be isolated and futile. "You can leave," Javier told Sebastian. "Take your family and go. Disappear and live, or stay and die. Your choice." Sebastian looked around the table and saw the truth in every face. He'd left that night and was never seen again in the territories controlled by La Corona. Marco, Don Arturo's son, was given a similar ultimatum. He chose exile, accepting a generous payment in exchange for his silence and departure. Within 2 weeks, Javier Moreno had consolidated complete control of La Corona. He was 32 years old. The takeover was so smooth, so bloodless compared to what could have been, that it actually enhanced Javier's reputation. People marveled at how he'd outmaneuvered rivals without triggering a war. What they didn't see were the months of preparation, the alliances built, the leverage gathered, the fears cultivated. By the time Javier made his move, the outcome was already determined. As the new head of La Corona, Javier restructured the organization with ruthless efficiency. He understood that traditional hierarchies created vulnerabilities. If law enforcement arrested someone high up, they could potentially expose the entire operation. So he implemented a cellular structure where different branches had minimal contact with each other, where information flowed upward but not laterally. He divided operations into compartments: production, transportation, distribution, enforcement, finance. Each branch had its own leadership that reported directly to him. No one had a complete picture except Javier himself. This created absolute dependence on his coordination while limiting the damage any single arrest could cause. But organizational structure was only part of his approach. What truly defined Javier's rule was his systematic use of fear as a management tool. He established clear, brutal precedents for every type of transgression. Stealing from the organization resulted in public execution, but not immediate. The person would be held for days, giving everyone time to know what was coming, to imagine themselves in that position. When the execution finally happened, it was designed for maximum psychological impact: public, violent, memorable. Betraying to authorities was met with collective punishment. If someone cooperated with law enforcement, their family paid the price too. This created a powerful deterrent. You might be willing to risk yourself, but could you risk your children, your spouse, your parents? Javier understood that most people's boundaries dissolved when those they loved were threatened. Incompetence was treated differently than disloyalty. If someone failed because they lacked skill or made an honest error, punishment was measured. They might be demoted or fined, but not killed. This distinction was crucial. It meant people focused their fear on the things Javier actually cared about: loyalty, discretion, following orders, rather than being paralyzed by the possibility of any mistake leading to death. He also instituted a system of rewards that was as calculated as his punishments. Those who performed well received bonuses, public recognition, opportunities for advancement. But these rewards always came with subtle reminders of their source. A loyal lieutenant might receive a new house for his family, a generous gift, but also a quiet demonstration that Javier could provide or take away comfort at will. Javier's personal demeanor reinforced his reputation. He was always calm, always controlled. He never shouted, never showed anger, never appeared flustered. When someone disappointed him, he didn't rage, he simply looked at them with a slight expression of regret, as if they'd made a choice he now had to respond to. That quiet disappointment was more terrifying than any threat because it suggested an inevitability to what would follow. He dressed impeccably, expensive suits, polished shoes, subtle jewelry. His appearance communicated that he was above the chaos, untouched by the violence that surrounded him. While his soldiers dealt with the messy reality of enforcement, Javier presented as a businessman, someone who made decisions from a position of clean, absolute authority. He also carefully controlled his accessibility. Unlike Don Arturo, who'd maintained an open-door policy, Javier was difficult to reach. Meetings had to be scheduled through intermediaries, requests went through channels. This created both mystique and dependency. People couldn't appeal directly to him, couldn't try to build personal relationships that might create competing loyalties. Everything flowed through the structure he'd designed. Under Javier's leadership, La Corona grew exponentially. He expanded operations beyond traditional drug smuggling into weapons trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. He established partnerships with criminal organizations in other countries, creating an international network that moved products and money across continents. His approach to territorial expansion was methodical. Rather than simply invading rivals' territories and triggering wars, he identified weak or poorly led organizations and absorbed them systematically. Sometimes this meant eliminating their leadership and offering their mid-level operators better positions in La Corona. Sometimes it meant demonstrating overwhelming force and then negotiating surrender that looked like partnership. The key was always giving people a choice that wasn't really a choice. Join us and prosper, or resist and be destroyed. Most chose survival and profit. Javier also invested heavily in corruption. He understood that government officials, law enforcement, military personnel, all could be bought or intimidated. He built a comprehensive network of compromised individuals at every level, from local police to federal officials. Some were motivated by greed, accepting bribes that dwarfed their official salaries. Others were motivated by fear, cooperating because Javier had leverage on them or because they'd seen what happened to officials who refused. This network of corruption was perhaps his most valuable asset. It allowed La Corona to operate with relative impunity, getting warnings before raids, having charges dismissed or reduced, obtaining confidential information about investigations. It turned the machinery of law enforcement into a tool that worked for him as much as against him. Within 5 years of taking control, Javier had transformed La Corona from a regional operation into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the hemisphere. Revenue increased tenfold, territory expanded into regions that had been controlled by rivals for decades. The organization's name carried weight from border towns to international capitals, but expansion created new challenges. With size came complexity, more people, more operations, more potential points of failure. Javier responded by tightening control even further. He implemented an intelligence network within the organization, people whose job was to watch other members, to report on loyalty, to identify potential problems before they materialized. Everyone knew such watchers existed, but no one knew who they were. This created paranoia that served Javier's purposes. People policed themselves, afraid that any deviation might be reported. He also became more isolated. At the top of his empire, surrounded by wealth and power that would have seemed impossible in his poverty-stricken childhood, Javier trusted no one. He maintained no real friendships, no intimate relationships that weren't transactional. His romantic partners were kept at arm's length, never allowed close enough to become liabilities or influences. This isolation was strategic. but also necessary. He'd built his power on fear, and fear required distance. If people saw him as human, capable of doubt, vulnerable to emotion, it would undermine the image of cold, calculated authority that made him effective. So he remained alone at the center of a web of his own design, connected to thousands but intimate with none. Miguel Reyes had worked for La Corona for 6 years. He was a mid-level logistics coordinator responsible for organizing transport routes and coordinating with truck drivers. It was a good position. It paid well, it kept him away from direct violence, and it gave him enough authority to feel like he mattered in the organization. But Miguel had a problem: gambling. He'd hidden it well for years, but the debts had grown beyond his ability to manage. In desperation, he'd done something unforgivable. He'd skimmed money from transport payments, creating false receipts and pocketing the difference. It wasn't much, just enough to cover his immediate debts. He'd planned to pay it back before anyone noticed. But Javier's organization noticed everything. Miguel was brought to a warehouse on the outskirts of the territory La Corona controlled. He knew what the summons meant. His hands shook as he drove there, but he went anyway. Running would only make things worse, would extend the punishment to his family. The warehouse was cold, despite the season. Miguel was made to kneel on the concrete floor. His hands were bound. Then came the waiting, hours of it, during which his imagination conjured every possible scenario. This was part of the punishment, he understood: the anticipation, the fear, the certainty of pain to come. When Javier finally arrived, Miguel felt almost relieved. At least the waiting was over. "You stole from me," Javier said, his voice soft and calm. Miguel tried to explain about the debts, the gambling, the desperation. Javier listened without expression. "I don't want explanations," Javier said. "I want you to understand something. Fear is more valuable than loyalty. Loyalty can be faked. Fear cannot." He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a knife. What happened next took 20 minutes, though it felt like hours to Miguel. He was hurt. Not killed, not permanently maimed, but hurt in ways that would leave scars, both physical and psychological. It was calibrated perfectly, enough to serve as deterrent, not so much that it would incapacitate him. When it was over, Javier crouched beside Miguel's collapsed form. "You'll continue working for me," he said. "You'll work twice as hard, and every peso you earn goes toward repaying what you stole, with interest. If you do this loyally for the next 3 years, your debt is forgiven, and we never speak of this again. If you fail, if you run, if you betray me, your family learns what fear really means. Do you understand?" Miguel, through pain and tears, nodded. "Good," Javier said, standing. "Someone get him medical attention. He has work tomorrow." This was how Javier managed his empire, through fear, but also through measured cruelty that served specific purposes. He'd punished Miguel severely enough that the story would spread, that others would think twice before stealing. But he hadn't killed him, which demonstrated that redemption was possible if you accepted the consequences and worked to make amends. It kept people within the system rather than driving them to desperate acts of betrayal. But there was a cost to this approach that Javier couldn't see. Fear was indeed powerful, but it was also corrosive. It created an environment where everyone was constantly calculating survival, where loyalty was performative rather than genuine, where the organization was held together by threat rather than shared purpose. Carlos Mendoza had been with La Corona since before Javier's rise to power. He'd served under Don Arturo and had survived the transition to Javier's leadership by being useful and keeping his head down. He ran enforcement operations in the Eastern Territories, a crucial role that required both tactical skill and absolute discretion. But Carlos was tired of the violence, tired of the paranoia, tired of living in a system where everyone was afraid all the time. He'd joined La Corona in his 20s, motivated by the same poverty and lack of options that drove most recruits. Now, in his 40s, with children of his own, he was beginning to question the life he'd built. But the breaking point came on a humid evening when Carlos was ordered to execute 2 young men who'd been caught selling product in territory without authorization. They were barely 18, stupid kids trying to make money who didn't understand whose territory they'd wandered into. Following Javier's protocols, Carlos was supposed to make their deaths public and brutal, a message to others. He carried out the order. But afterward, looking at their bodies, he felt something crack inside him. They could have been his own sons. They probably had mothers who loved them, who were waiting for them to come home. And he'd killed them not because they were dangerous or because they'd betrayed anyone, just because they'd crossed an invisible line in a power struggle they probably didn't even understand. That night, Carlos made a decision that would alter the trajectory of La Corona. He began gathering like-minded members. People who were tired of Javier's regime, who felt the organization had become something toxic under his leadership, who remembered when La Corona was run with different principles, corrupt principles, criminal principles, but at least with some limits on the cruelty. This conspiracy grew slowly and carefully. Carlos knew that Javier had informants throughout the organization, that trust was nearly impossible. So he approached people individually, feeling them out with careful questions, never revealing the full scope of his intentions until he was certain they could be trusted. What Carlos didn't fully understand was that Javier's intelligence network was more comprehensive than anyone suspected. Within 3 weeks of the first recruitment conversation, Javier knew about the conspiracy. He knew every name, every meeting, every plan being discussed. But instead of acting immediately, Javier watched and waited. He wanted to see how far the conspiracy would spread, how many people would reveal their disloyalty. This was his method, not reactive suppression, but methodical identification and elimination of every thread of resistance. The conspiracy grew to 12 members, all mid to senior level operators in different branches of La Corona. They planned carefully, knowing that moving against Javier required overwhelming force and speed. They chose a date, a monthly leadership meeting where Javier would be accessible, where they could act collectively before he could isolate them. 2 days before the planned action, Javier moved. The executions happened simultaneously across the territories La Corona controlled. At exactly 3 a.m., teams moved on the 12 conspirators. They were taken from their homes. Some fought, some tried to run, some simply surrendered when they understood the futility of resistance. By dawn, all 12 were detained in locations throughout the organization's infrastructure. But Javier didn't kill them immediately. Instead, he staged what he called a tribunal, a gathering of La Corona's entire senior and mid-level leadership. More than 100 people assembled in a compound secured by armed guards, brought there under the guise of an emergency meeting. When they arrived, they found the 12 conspirators on their knees in the center of a large room, beaten but alive. Javier stood before them, flanked by his most loyal enforcers. "These men," Javier said, his voice carrying through the silent room, "conspired to kill me. They planned to take control of La Corona through violence against its rightful leadership." He walked along the line of kneeling men, looking down at each. Carlos Mendoza, who I trusted with the Eastern Territories, Ramon Paz, who handled our financial networks, Julio Santos, who coordinated enforcement operations. He named each one, reciting their roles, their histories with the organization. Then he turned to face the assembled leadership. I could have killed them quietly, I could have made them disappear like so many others, but I want you all to understand something fundamental about the world we live in. He pulled out a pistol and walked back to Carlos, pressing the barrel against the man's temple. Fear is the foundation of everything we've built. Fear of consequences, fear of betrayal, fear of weakness. Without fear, there is no order. Without order, there is no organization. Without organization, we're just animals tearing at each other. He moved the gun to the next conspirator. These men forgot that fear applies to everyone, including them. They thought their positions, their relationships, their years of service would protect them. They were wrong. What followed was methodical and brutal. Javier executed each conspirator personally, one by one, while the assembled leadership watched. He didn't rush. Between each execution, he explained what the specific individual had done, what conversations they'd had, what plans they'd made. He demonstrated that he'd known everything all along, that there were no secrets from him, that even quiet whispers reached his ears. But he didn't stop with the conspirators themselves. After the 12th execution, Javier turned to the assembled crowd. Some of you knew about this conspiracy and said nothing. You knew and chose to wait, to see if they'd succeed before deciding which side to support. That cowardice is as dangerous as active betrayal. He nodded to his enforcers, who moved into the crowd and pulled out 5 more people, men who'd been approached by the conspirators and had declined to join, but also hadn't reported it. Silence is complicity, Javier said. These 5 were executed as well. By the time the tribunal ended, 17 people were dead, and every person in that room understood the message. Javier saw everything, knew everything, and forgave nothing. The fear that had always been present in La Corona intensified into something absolute. People returned to their territories, shaken, traumatized, but also perfectly clear about where power resided and what happened to those who challenged it. In the aftermath of the purge, La Corona became more efficient, but also more brittle. Fear motivated compliance, but it also stifled initiative. People followed orders precisely but took no risks, made no suggestions, avoided any action that might be interpreted as overreach or ambition. The organization functioned, but it was increasingly dependent on Javier's direct management of every significant decision. Javier himself changed. The conspiracy had revealed something he'd suspected but not fully confronted. Absolute power created absolute isolation. He'd built an empire where everyone feared him, but that fear meant no one was truly loyal. Everyone complied because the cost of defiance was death, but if circumstances changed, if he showed weakness, if a real threat emerged, he couldn't count on anyone fighting for him rather than just protecting themselves. He responded to this realization by withdrawing further. He moved to a compound with military-grade security, accessible only by invitation. He communicated increasingly through intermediaries. Even his senior leadership rarely saw him in person anymore. This distance enhanced his mystique, but also disconnected him from the day-to-day realities of the organization. Years passed in this fashion. La Corona continued to dominate its territories, continued to generate enormous profits, continued to expand its reach. But cracks were forming in the foundation. Younger members who'd joined the organization under Javier's regime and known nothing else began to chafe under the constant fear. They'd never experienced the golden age under Don Arturo that older members sometimes whispered about, a time when the organization supposedly operated with honor, when violence was used sparingly, when there was brotherhood among members. In reality, that golden age was mythologized nonsense. Don Arturo had been plenty ruthless in his time, had ordered countless deaths, had used fear just like Javier. But memory was selective, and nostalgia painted the past in softer colors than reality deserved. Still, the mythology served a purpose. It created a competing narrative to Javier's rule, a sense that things could be different, that the current system wasn't the only possibility. But this narrative spread quietly through the younger ranks, not as organized conspiracy, but as ambient dissatisfaction, a collective exhaustion with living under permanent threat. Javier sensed this discontent but struggled to address it. His tools were intimidation and reward, but intimidation was creating the problem, and rewards meant nothing to people who'd grown numb to them. He was trapped by the very system he'd created. Any show of leniency would be interpreted as weakness, but continued hardline rule was fostering resentment that accumulated like pressure behind a dam. While La Corona's internal tensions simmered, an external threat emerged. A coalition of rival organizations, tired of being marginalized by Javier's dominance, formed an alliance specifically to challenge La Corona. They called themselves Los Herederos, the inheritors, and their message was simple. Javier Moreno had monopolized too much, taken too much, crushed too many smaller operations. It was time to break his empire and redistribute its territories. Los Herederos were led by Mateo Ruiz, a younger boss who'd watched Javier's rise and learned from it. Mateo understood that defeating Javier required strategy rather than just force. So rather than launching direct military attacks, Los Herederos began targeting La Corona's infrastructure, supply chains, corrupt officials, distribution networks. They started small, ambushing transport vehicles, killing drivers, but leaving the vehicles and product intact, with messages spray-painted on the sides. The empire is mortal. The king bleeds. It was psychological warfare designed to undermine the aura of invincibility Javier had cultivated. Then they went after the corruption network. Los Herederos identified officials on La Corona's payroll and approached them with an offer: switch allegiance and receive protection, or stay loyal to Javier and face consequences. Some officials remained with Javier out of fear. Others switched sides. A few tried to play both sides and were killed by one or the other as examples. The effect was to create chaos in the systems Javier depended on. Intelligence became unreliable. Was an official truly loyal or feeding information to Los Herederos? Operations became uncertain. Would the usual safe routes remain secure? The carefully calibrated machine Javier had built began experiencing disruptions that compounded on each other. Javier responded with characteristic ruthlessness. He ordered massive retaliation, attacks on Los Herederos territories, executions of suspected collaborators, increased enforcement of loyalty within La Corona. But this aggressive response played into Mateo's strategy. The more brutal Javier became, the more he alienated people within and outside his organization. He was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, against Los Herederos, against internal dissatisfaction, against the erosion of his corruption networks. The violence escalated throughout the territories. Body counts rose. Law enforcement, facing public pressure over the chaos, began launching more aggressive operations against both organizations. The careful balance Javier had maintained, enough corruption to operate, not so much violence that it triggered overwhelming government response, collapsed into open warfare that drew attention from federal and even international authorities. Diego Martinez had been Javier's enforcer for 8 years. He was one of the few people allowed regular access to Javier's inner circle, responsible for coordinating security and carrying out the most sensitive operations. He'd proven himself ruthless, efficient, and seemingly loyal through countless tests. But Diego was tired. Not tired in the way Carlos Mendoza had been. Diego wasn't troubled by conscience. He was simply exhausted by the constant pressure of serving Javier, of living in an environment where one mistake could mean death, where loyalty was rewarded but never trusted, where fear governed every interaction. More importantly, Diego was ambitious. He'd watched Javier's empire fray under the pressure from Los Herederos. He'd seen opportunities that Javier, isolated in his compound and increasingly paranoid, wasn't seeing. And he'd come to believe that La Corona needed different leadership, specifically his leadership. Diego began making contact with Mateo Ruiz through back channels. His proposal was audacious. He would deliver Javier Moreno to Los Herederos. In exchange, he wanted control of half of La Corona's territories, with the remainder split among the coalition. It would end the war, eliminate the leader whose reputation still held significant psychological power, and reorganize the criminal landscape into something more stable. Mateo agreed. The two men orchestrated what they called the transition, a carefully planned operation that would capture Javier alive, allowing Los Herederos to make a public demonstration of his defeat before executing him. Diego's position made the betrayal possible. He knew Javier's security protocols, his routines, the rare occasions when he was potentially vulnerable. He identified an upcoming meeting where Javier would travel to a secondary compound to meet with financial coordinators, one of the few instances where Javier still conducted business in person because it involved complex transactions requiring direct oversight. The attack was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. Diego ensured that security at the location was staffed by people loyal to him rather than to Javier. When Javier arrived with his usual protective detail, they drove into what appeared to be a secure facility, but was actually a carefully prepared trap. Los Herederos fighters were positioned throughout the compound. The attack happened fast, overwhelming firepower, targeting Javier's guards before they could effectively respond. Within minutes, Javier's entire protective detail was dead or incapacitated. Javier himself was extracted alive from the vehicle where he'd been sheltered by dying bodyguards. He was brought to a room where Mateo Ruiz and Diego Martinez waited. Despite the blood on his face and the obvious reality of his situation, Javier showed no fear. He looked at Diego with something resembling curiosity. "How much?" Javier asked simply. "It's not about money," Diego replied. "It's about evolution. You built something remarkable, but you can't evolve. You're locked into methods that worked but don't anymore. The war with Los Herederos is destroying everything because you can't imagine compromise, can't imagine shared power." "Shared power is weakness," Javier said. It was a statement of belief, the fundamental principle that had guided his entire reign. "Maybe," Diego acknowledged, "or maybe it's adaptation. The world changes. Organizations that don't change die." Mateo interrupted their conversation. "This isn't a philosophy debate. You're finished, Moreno. The empire you built is being divided as we speak. Your territories are being occupied. Your people are being given the choice to join us or die. By tomorrow, La Corona exists only as history." He wasn't exaggerating. As they spoke, coordinated operations were happening throughout the territories. Los Herederos, with intelligence provided by Diego, was moving on key locations. La Corona's leadership, already demoralized by the ongoing war, offered minimal resistance. Many simply surrendered when presented with the reality that Javier had been captured. The empire built on fear collapsed with stunning speed once the source of that fear was removed. They held Javier for 3 days before executing him. This wasn't mercy or hesitation, it was strategy. Mateo wanted the story of Javier's capture to spread completely, wanted every member of La Corona, every rival organization, every corrupt official to understand that the supposedly untouchable boss had been brought down. The delay served the same purpose Javier had once used: fear through anticipation. During those 3 days, Javier was kept in a basement room, bare concrete, single light bulb, minimal furniture. He was fed and his wounds were treated, but he was also completely isolated except for occasional visits from Mateo or Diego. In that isolation, away from the empire he'd built, Javier had time to think. For years he'd lived at the center of constant activity, making decisions that affected thousands, managing an organization that spanned territories and countries. Now there was just silence and the certainty of approaching death. He thought about his father dying in a field for wages that wouldn't feed the family. He thought about his mother and sister, left behind when he'd gone searching for power. He'd sent them money over the years, enough that they lived comfortably, but he hadn't seen them in more than a decade. They probably didn't know what he'd become, the things he'd done, the empire of fear he'd constructed. He thought about the hundreds of people he'd killed or ordered killed. Some had deserved it by any reasonable standard. They'd been violent, predatory, dangerous, but many had died simply for crossing invisible lines, for challenging his authority, for being in the wrong place at the wrong circumstances. He'd treated human lives as chess pieces, sacrificed without hesitation when it served his strategy. And he thought about fear, the tool he'd mastered, the principle he'd built everything on. He'd been right that fear was powerful, that it could motivate compliance and create order in chaotic environments. But Diego had also been right. Fear had limitations. It couldn't inspire genuine loyalty. It couldn't create the flexibility needed to adapt to changing circumstances. It held things together through pressure, but pressure eventually found cracks to exploit. On the 3rd day, Mateo came to the room and told Javier it was time. They took him to a location outside the city, an abandoned warehouse that Los Herederos had prepared. There were cameras set up to record what would happen. The execution would be filmed and distributed as proof of Javier's death and as a warning to anyone who might consider rebuilding La Corona. A crowd had gathered, members of Los Herederos, former La Corona members who'd switched allegiance, even some civilians, from areas that had suffered under Javier's rule. They wanted to witness the end of the man who dominated the region through terror. Javier was made to kneel. His hands were bound behind his back, an echo of the position he'd put countless others in. Mateo stood before him holding a pistol. "Any last words?" Mateo asked. It was a formality, but he seemed genuinely curious what Javier might say. Javier looked out at the crowd watching him. He saw faces filled with satisfaction, with rage, with the kind of hatred that comes from prolonged fear. These were people who'd lived under his rule or fought against it. To them, his death was justice, revenge, or simply practical elimination of a threat. "Fear is more valuable than loyalty," Javier said, repeating the words that had defined his philosophy. "But fear is also mortal. Everything built on fear dies with the source." Those were his final words. Mateo raised the pistol and fired 3 times. Javier Moreno, the man who'd ruled through calculated terror, who'd built an empire through psychological warfare and ruthless intelligence, collapsed onto the concrete. The crowd erupted in cheers. The territories that had belonged to La Corona were divided among Los Herederos and their allies, exactly as Diego and Mateo had planned. Diego received significant territory as promised and established himself as a boss in his own right. He tried to rule differently than Javier had, more consultation with lieutenants, less reliance on fear, more emphasis on profit-sharing and shared decision-making. But the fundamental nature of the business hadn't changed. You still had to enforce territory, still had to punish betrayal, still had to compete with rivals through violence or threat of violence. Within a year, Diego found himself implementing many of the same tactics Javier had used, discovering that the logic of criminal enterprise pushed towards centralized control and intimidation regardless of initial intentions. Mateo, leading Los Herederos, faced similar evolution. The coalition that had united against Javier began fracturing once the common enemy was eliminated. Disputes emerged over territory, over profit splits, over respect and hierarchy. Mateo spent increasing amounts of time managing these internal tensions, using both negotiation and violence to hold the coalition together. He'd criticized Javier for being inflexible, but he found himself increasingly rigid as he tried to maintain control over fractious allies. The broader landscape remained violent. With La Corona's controlling presence removed, smaller organizations tried to establish themselves. Territorial boundaries became contested. The relative stability of Javier's monopolistic rule, brutal but predictable, gave way to chaotic competition. Body counts actually increased in the year following Javier's death, as multiple organizations fought for position in the new hierarchy. Law enforcement, which had struggled against La Corona's corruption networks, found themselves facing a more complex challenge. Instead of one major organization to target, there were now dozens of smaller groups harder to track, less predictable. Some officials who'd been on La Corona's payroll found themselves approached by multiple organizations, creating complicated webs of competing loyalties. For civilians living in affected territories, Javier's death brought no relief. Different bosses, same violence. Different names, same fear. The war continued, only the players had changed. 2 years after Javier's execution, a documentary filmmaker obtained access to people who'd known him at different stages of his life. The footage painted a complex picture of who Javier Moreno had been. His mother, interviewed in the comfortable house Javier had bought her, spoke of the boy who'd left home at 14. "He was gentle when he was young," she said, her voice heavy with grief and guilt. "He loved his sister. He helped me with chores. But poverty does something to people. It makes them hard or it breaks them. Javier became hard." A former schoolmate remembered Javier as smart, ambitious, but also isolated. He didn't have friends, really. He had people he knew, but he kept everyone at distance even back then. It was like he decided early that relationships were liabilities. Members of La Corona who'd served under Javier offered different perspectives. Some described him as a brilliant strategist who'd elevated the organization to unprecedented power. Others spoke of the constant terror of working for someone who tolerated no mistakes, no weakness, no divided loyalty. "You were always one error away from death," one former lieutenant said. "It made you careful, but it also made you hollow inside. You couldn't trust anyone, couldn't relax, couldn't be human." Diego Martinez, now running his own territory, was interviewed in a dimly lit office. "You were always one error away from death," he said of working for Javier. "It made you careful, but it also made you hollow inside. You couldn't trust anyone, couldn't relax, couldn't be human." When asked if he'd rule differently, Diego paused. "I thought I would. But this business has its own logic. You either control through fear, or you get replaced by someone who will." Javier understood that better than anyone. A former federal investigator who'd pursued Javier for years offered a different perspective. Moreno was brilliant, but he made one fatal miscalculation. He believed fear could replace loyalty indefinitely. It can't. The moment someone powerful enough stopped being afraid, like Diego, the entire structure collapsed. In the territories Javier once controlled, violence actually increased after his death. Multiple factions competed for power, creating chaos where there had been brutal order. The civilians caught in between found that one tyrant had simply been replaced by many. Javier's mother, in her final interview, wept quietly. "I have a house because of him. I also have nightmares about the mothers whose sons he killed. He gave me everything and took everything at the same time." Javier Moreno died at 39 years old, kneeling in a warehouse, killed by the very methods he'd perfected. He'd escaped poverty, built an empire, commanded absolute power. But he died alone, feared by everyone, loved by no one, betrayed by the man he'd trusted most. His empire lasted less than a week without him. The fear that held it together evaporated the moment he couldn't enforce it anymore. Everything he'd built, the networks, the territories, the corruption, the power, dissolved like smoke. The boy from the village who swore he'd never be powerless again had achieved everything he sought. And it meant nothing in the end. Fear had made him powerful. Fear had isolated him. Fear had killed him. His legacy wasn't the wealth or the territory. It was the lesson carved into everyone who witnessed his rise and fall. Crime doesn't elevate, it destroys. Power built on fear is power waiting to collapse. And in the end, everyone pays. Everyone.